Welcome back, students, to another one of your flipped lectures. In today's lecture, we're going to discuss the 1920s in the United States, also known as the Roaring Twenties, for how dynamic both the economy and culture was during this decade. So we're going to talk about the reasons why the 1920s roared, and we're going to come back to this at the end of the flipped lecture. But ultimately, the reason for a lot of the events we're going to talk about is that Americans are very tired of what they considered to be crusades. In the era leading up to 1920, there was a lot of social political movements that a lot of people were involved in. Some of these were successful and some of them weren't, but that combined with World War I led people to kind of be tired of all this activism and trying to make the world a better place and social movements, and they desired to return to normalcy. The idea of wanting everything to go back to normal. And this also was coupled with the idea of the pursuit of the good life, kind of brought about by a very prosperous economy. This all led to a large emphasis on the ideas of materialism and individualism during this decade. So we're going to come back to these concepts at the end, but I wanted to introduce them at the beginning. But kicking off the 1920s was one of these social crusades that finally came to fruition in 1920. The women's rights movement had been active in the United States for a long time leading up to 1920, arguing for women's rights and also for the women's right to vote, which had been denied to them previously. But in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution would be passed that would finally give women the right to vote in the United States. As you can see here, the suffrage map, suffrage means the right to vote. It doesn't mean suffering. It means suffrage, which is the right to vote. As you can see, there is a lot of states where basically women did not have the right to vote at all, and many in which they had limited voting rights. As a result, a women's movement dedicated to changing this ended up going all the way to the federal government in Washington, D.C., and through a series of marches and activism and petition writing, they managed to finally convince the United States government to pass the 19th Amendment, which will finally give women the right to vote from that point forward. And here is a picture of that amendment being signed. And the 19th Amendment is commemorated on a stamp as well. Basically, this woman is wearing the fashion of the 1920s and celebrating the fact that women finally had the right to vote. But the 1920s are going to be reflective of the worldwide changes brought on by World War I. We talked about these changes, and that basically what is going to happen is after the horrors of World War I, people are going to desire a return to what they consider to be good times and an idea of basically extravagance and having fun, whereas the last 10 years had been kind of rocked by the idea of social turmoil as well as a world war. This change is going to be reflected in society and culture, especially with the youth of the 1920s. The youth culture is largely going to reject the social norms and traditional values of the older generations. Part of this has to do with the disillusionment after World War I, and basically the idea that the world was changing very rapidly meant that society was going to change too. The flapper girl, and there's a picture of one right in this slide, basically is going to be representative of kind of these changing social norms. Flapper girls were girls who went out dancing, they drank alcohol, they smoked cigarettes, they basically believed in having sex before marriage, and all sorts of other things that were considered to be contrary to good traditional moral values. Alcohol in the 1920s is going to become a very big thing, which is partially going to lead to the passing of prohibition and the outlawing of alcohol in the United States for years. And another thing that is going to largely change society is actually going to be the automobile. This newfound mobility and freedom is basically going to cause there to be a lot of social changes, including a change to even the idea of dating. Prior to the automobile, if you basically went to go call upon a young lady, you would sit in her parents' house and you would talk to them in a sitting room called a parlor, and you would likely basically have your entire date right there. But after the automobile, young people have unprecedented freedom to basically do as they want, which is going to lead to a lot of these social changes. In the field of economics, the 1920s are also going to represent a large change. Henry Ford, the creator of the Ford Motor Company, is going to introduce mass production on a scale that people hadn't really seen prior to it. he will come up with the idea of the assembly line, in which one person is responsible for only one piece of a larger operation. So if you were making a car, you might be the guy who put on the right wheel, and so basically you would just simply do your same job over and over, and this division of labor is going to mean that cars can be produced much, much faster because you don't have to have one person who knows how to build an entire car. You just have to have a bunch of people who know how to do just one thing well. Henry Ford is also going to introduce a different concept called the Ford model. And the Ford model is basically that your employees should be your best customer. That you should pay your employees enough and that your prices should be low enough that all of your employees will buy your products. This means that you will actually get part of the money you are paying your employees back because they will buy your product. And ultimately, Henry Ford believed that this would create more wealth on the whole, because if he paid his employees well, they would shop at other stores, and that would in turn create more wealth, which would lead to more people buying cars. And so that is the Ford model. When you read Youth, Industry, and Progress, keep in mind this Ford model. 20s are also going to have a lot of new technologies, such as the affordable automobile, cinema, all these different things. You're going to have brand new products because of factories and mass production that are going to be available to people. And you're also going to have the availability of credit so that people can actually buy more than they can afford at a given time. And so people are going to basically get credit in order to live beyond their means in the 1920s. That's partially why this is going to be a period of such extravagance, because if you buy on credit, you don't actually have to have the money at the time for the things you are buying. So here's a picture of the automobile, and the automobile is going to represent one of the largest changes in the United States. Think about how many things in this country right now are reliant upon the automobile. Electric power is also going to start to light all of these cities, major cities in America, and it's going to start to light all the places around. And electrical power is also going to mean that businesses now didn't have to be concentrated around water sources and other places where energy was produced. This meant that production in factories could increase even more because they were not now shackled to having to be in a particular place, because electric power travels instantaneously. Again, when you read Youth, Industry, and Progress, bear in mind the idea of how electrical power is going to change the United States economy. Another big impact the 1920s is going to have on American culture is the rise of the American consumer. For the first time in American culture, there's going to be an economy that's going to be based upon mass consumption. Prior to this time, most of the things you bought were made in the immediate area where you lived. But now, large companies and large factories can mass produce goods and sell them in large retail stores such as Macy's and Woolworth, and this is going to create a mass culture where Americans all over the United States are going to be buying the same products and sharing the same culture for the first time. And a lot of these new products that I alluded to before are going to be leisure products, and they're going to be luxuries. And these things used to not be available to the masses, but now because of mass productions, prices are going to come down on all these luxury and leisure goods that today we pretty much think that we couldn't live without. Here's a great example of an advertisement for the idea of Listerine. And as you can see, advertisements haven't changed much, as this advertisement is basically saying if you have bad breath, then the girl is not going to kiss you. Gum commercials today have the exact same marketing technique. The radio also is introduced into American society, bringing mass media and shared cultural references across the United States. Americans all around the country could listen to the same radio programs and get the same information. This radio medium is really going to change the United States, and it's going to now mean that information as well as entertainment can be produced and distributed on a mass scale. Eventually, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the politician during the 1930s, will take advantage of this radio the same way that politicians take advantage of television today. So here's just a couple of advertisements, and I want you to look at these advertisements and think about how they're similar to advertisements that you might see today. The idea of vacuum cleaners being commercially available in the 1920s, a result of mass production. The idea of brand name clothing is developed during the 1920s, where now a clothing company could produce a large amount of clothes, and so you get brand names such as Oshkosh B'gosh, which is advertised as the world's best fitting overall. So if you ever wear or buy designer clothes, you have something in the 1920s to thank for it. Wrigley's gum is going to become a really big thing in the 1920s. The idea of chewing gum becomes a big thing in the 1920s and becomes a leisure activity. Seasonal advertisements, like this one for Halloween, is also going to kind of develop, and we see today that seasonal advertising is a very big thing. All these things are going to start to be new in the 1920s. The Oreo cookie is also going to be introduced, and the idea of brand name foods is also going to be something new in the 1920s. And the idea of large retail stores, such as Macy's and Woolworths, are also going to come about during this time. The idea that you would go to a store and it would be large and have a ton of possibilities and different combinations of products is going to be new in the 1920s, but is something that we almost can't imagine being without today. Here's a picture of the inside of a Woolworths, where basically you could go to this store and they had so many different kinds of products that really it was almost one-stop shopping. So really briefly, you're going to read the article called The Age of Play. The Age of Play is going to reflect this idea that people in the 1920s are really going to want things like entertainment. This is going to be a time of excess and a time of leisure. You are going to have professional sports, kind of basically personified by the person of Babe Ruth. Professional sports are going to become a big deal, especially professional baseball, in a way that really it had never been as popular before. You're going to have movie theaters are going to start basically playing films, and theater attendance among Americans is going to skyrocket during this time. The idea of packing up your automobile, which is new, and going out to the country to camp is also going to be a new leisure activity that is very popular today, going to be introduced in kind of mainstream culture in the 1920s. Here's a picture of the Cotton Club, which was basically one of the most exclusive clubs in New York City that played jazz music. So people during this time would frequent music clubs where they would basically drink and listen to jazz music, dance, and socialize. So the idea of the 1920s is that there's a big emphasis on entertainment and a big emphasis on leisure that has led some to call it not just the Roaring Twenties, but also the Age of Play. Another thing that was going on in the 1920s was the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance is going to originate in Harlem, New York, but it's going to be the revival of African American culture in the United States for the first time since slavery was abolished during the Civil War. And the Harlem Renaissance is going to be characterized by the development of all sorts of new culture brought about by the African American community. Jazz music is going to become wildly popular in the American mainstream, and artists like Duke Ellington are going to bring this type of music to the masses, and it's going to be enjoyed by Americans outside of the African American community. You're also going to have basically a rise of literature, of new literature coming out of this African American community in Harlem, and the most popular figure is going to be a guy by the name of Langston Hughes. And all of this leads to something called the New Negro movement. And the New Negro movement's goal is to overcome the racism that was in the United States following the Civil War, which ended in 1865 all the way up to the 1920s. And the question that everybody was asking was, how do you overcome racism? And the New Negro movement answered that by saying that how you counter racism is by changing the image of the community by showing that they are just as intelligent, just as talented as the rest of the United States in this time. The New Negro movement is going to be characterized by an intense racial pride in being a new Negro and not being ashamed of this fact. And so there's going to be a big emphasis on increased education within these communities, an increase in literature and arts and music, as well as more writing in political and social commentary. Again, the goal was to show that basically this community was just as talented, just as valuable as the mainstream American majority community. But these Roaring Twenties weren't all good times, because they created some very serious problems that would lead to future hardships in the United States. There's going to be an economic bubble created. Remember, we talked about the bubble, where basically it means that the value of things is going to be much higher than they're actually worth. Sorry, not the value, the price of things is going to be higher than it's actually worth, and eventually bubbles burst, and that creates economic recession. And what happens is that with all this mass production, people create too much. It's called overproduction, and so basically there is more being produced than people are willing to buy. And when supply goes up and demand remains the same, the prices are going to go down. This is going to lead to basically a lot of these factories, a lot of these companies that had done so well in the early 1920s, they're going to have to start cutting back, and even some of them are going to go bankrupt by the late 1920s into the Great Depression. There was also too much credit available in the 1920s. This meant that too many people borrowed too much money to basically live the good life during the 1920s. But eventually all that credit that people borrowed and spent on things would have to be paid back. And that would again contribute to this bubble that would eventually burst when people were unable to pay back a lot of these loans. Another problem of the Roaring Twenties were these big excesses. This emphasis on having a good time. Entertainment meant that people were not saving money. So when the Depression hit and the good times stopped happening, people really didn't have any sort of a safety net to fall back on. And then ultimately, kind of with all of this stuff, and we're going to talk about it more with the Great Depression, during this time, everybody believed that they could become rich and wealthy, and that they should become rich and wealthy. And as a result, people took out large loans to buy stocks in the stock market. And they also made very risky investments with that money, with the belief that the good times would never end, and they would only continue to make money when they took these risks. But eventually that turned out not to be true, and all of these problems would play into the Great Depression that would come in 1929. So again, to reiterate the causes of the 1920s, why did they roar? Americans were very tired of these big political crusades, and they were tired after World War I. There was a desire to return back to normal life after this period of kind of great upheaval and change. And also people wanted to pursue the good life amid a prosperous economy. And this is going to lead again to an emphasis in this decade on the idea of materialism, of having things, and that what you have is what you are, as well as individualism, kind of a very self-centered time where what mattered was the individual, their wealth, their pleasure. So all of these things are going to contribute to the Roaring Twenties. But, as I said in the last slide, these Roaring Twenties would bring a lot of issues that are going to manifest themselves when we talk about the Great Depression in the 1930s.